This is part one of our conversation with Fred Runner, all about the history of Muir Woods and the Mount Tamalpais Railway. It's early afternoon in the dappled sunlight here on beautiful Bird Creek. There's a lot of activity up here in the trees. The last of the fledgling birds are exploring, and the insects are abuzz with summer energy. And speaking of good energy, we're here with Fred Runner, who has made a very interesting life for himself as local historian, author, train enthusiast, and for the past 25 years, a highly accomplished sound man for film and TV. Fred, what an honor. Hi and welcome.
Thank you, Gina. It's great to be here.
Fred, you are the man to ask about the history of Muir Woods, and I know you tell a good story. What was it like back in the early days of Muir Woods? If you could set the stage for us, maybe tell us a story about the very first tourists.
Sure. The first tourists to Muir Woods came by train and by gravity car on the crookedest railroad in the world. It was Marin County's most famous attraction, if you don't think of George Lucas, maybe. The scenic railway of Mount Tamalpais was built in 1896 and ran until Halloween Day, 1929, and then was scrapped the following year. But thousands of people came every year to come ride the train up Mount Tamalpais and see the view. And then starting in 1907, they were able to take a new branch line from the midpoint of the railroad, a place called Double Bow Knot, down into Muir Woods to see what the dark, dank forest of Muir Woods was like. They promoted it as a primeval wood, and people were amazed by it because there was this wonderful sort of diversity of the area. As anybody who's hiked the mountain knows, Mount Tamalpais is a semi-arid, almost desert-like, especially the higher you go in the summer. That's pretty obvious. But if you go to Muir Woods, it's cool and moist, and it smells great. And so to be able to experience the parched desert and the cool forest all in one day is a pretty extraordinary thing. And of course, we can do that today. But for those people that came from the Midwest, where things were pretty flat, or from back east, where perhaps they lived in some industrial city where things didn't smell so good, and of course, being able to see the city from the mountain and the Pacific Ocean and all the tremendous variety of scenery was one thing that Mount Tamalpais had to offer that the other scenic railways didn't have to offer. The other railways, when you took the train to the top of the mountain, you basically saw more mountains. And probably along the way you saw a river and some forests. But Mount Tamalpais had those things plus the Pacific Ocean and the Bay Area, and you could see north into Sonoma County, and on a good clear winter day you could see the Sierra Nevada mountains, and the variety was just stupendous. And still is. In 1923, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the man who invented Sherlock Holmes, that famous erudite detective, came to Mount Tamalpais in Muir Woods. He was traveling through San Francisco, and he took the train up the mountain and then a gravity car down into Muir Woods, and later wrote about his adventure, and he said, "In all our wanderings, we've never had a more glorious experience." And he said that the mountain and Muir Woods were developed by a private company that had done a excellent and reverent job of preserving these places, and that the government now owned Muir Woods, but that he felt that the government should own both Muir Woods and Mount Tamalpais because these are both rare and remarkable places, and he'd never been to another place in the world that was more incredible. In 1903, President Teddy Roosevelt stood at the rim of the Grand Canyon and said, "Leave it as it is. You cannot improve on it. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it. What you can do is to keep it for your children and your children's children, and for all who come after you as one of the great sights which every American, if he can travel at all, should see." Roosevelt, of course, meant that about the Grand Canyon, but again, this was an era being opened up to Americans and Europeans, and anybody who came to America at that point, by the rails that were taking people to what would become our national parks, and Mount Tamalpais was part of that. A wonderful human being named William Kent and his wife Elizabeth decided that they'd buy the bottom of Redwood Canyon in 1905 to save it as a place of sanctuary and and really the rare place that it is close to San Francisco. At the same time, Kent was friends with a guy named Sidney Cushing, who had built a railroad on Mount Tamalpais. The railroad brought the first tourists into Muir Woods in 1907. These were just regular run-of-the-mill folks. They weren't the hunters that had come before. People came by train and by gravity car, which was the railroad's most unique offering, I guess. It was the only railroad that we know of that ever had a thing called a gravity car, which was this funny little coaster that started at the top of Mount Tam and coasted down the mountain at 12 miles an hour. There was a guy named Gravity Man who operated the brake levers. The cars had no power at all. They just coasted, and he'd set the brakes as needed. And in two places where the grade flattened out, he'd actually release the brakes so they could coast through there, reaching a top speed of 25 miles an hour in those two spots. Anyway, John Muir was among those who came to Muir Woods by gravity car. One of the times that he did that was in 1909. He came with the Newton family, and there's a wonderful little story that some friends showed me that was in the Sierra Club magazine and was published in 1982, a piece of a journal written by Mary Newton, who had enjoyed the trip with Muir and wrote about their 3 days in Muir Woods, how they got there, the gravity trip in, how Muir was a popular man, how people came up to him all the time to shake his hands and ask if he was really John Muir, and John Muir had a good sense of humor about it.
Now, the tourists that would come in, probably from San Francisco, right? From the ferry, they take the train up?
Sure. The tourists that came to Muir Woods were from all over. They were people that were, for the very first time really in human history, able to explore the world easily through train travel. Rails were being laid to places that had never had rails before, places like the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone and Yosemite were all places that had new rails that people could come see the things that they had read about, could experience the marvels of those settings in a way that would have been much more complicated only a short time before, with wagon trips and mules and all that sort of thing. Rail travel was elegant. It was easy. It was clean, relatively. And you could do it relatively inexpensively. Instead of chartering a mule train or a mule team and some kind of a guide, you could just take the train and arrive at some place and at like the edge of the Grand Canyon and just be amazed.
So it was really the train that gave rise to tourism.
Yes. In fact, Stephen Ambrose, the historian, wrote some interesting things about the Transcontinental Railroad. He In a book that he wrote called Nothing Like It in the World, he wrote about the miracle as the Transcontinental Railroad was built. Lincoln was looking for a bit of distraction from the darkness of the Civil War. Pushing the Transcontinental Railroad across America has been compared to putting people on the moon. Ambrose points out that when people came across the country by wagon, that was a very difficult journey, very hazardous, that took forever. And if you were lucky, you could make 15 miles in a day. It was a very hard journey. And as soon as the Transcontinental Railroad opened up, a journey that took months took 6 days. And along with that was, alongside the tracks were telegraph wires. Suddenly, communications that traveled as fast as a human being on a horse, or perhaps by foot, could now instantly go from coast to coast. There was this miraculous change in almost no time at all. Ambrose points out that at the beginning of the 19th century that people got around pretty much the same as people had in Roman times, on foot or on horseback. And by the end of the 19th century, people were going places at 60 miles an hour. And in fact, there was some concern as we were getting close to being able to move along at 60 miles an hour that there might be some physical maximum that you would run smack into, and people would explode if they actually went 60 miles an hour.
Back in Marin County here, you've written a book recently about it. And Fred, we were really hoping you'd tell us a little bit about your book.
Sure. The book is called The Mount Tamalpais Scenic Railway. It's a book about the steam trains that used to climb Mount Tamalpais. The book that I've been working on is a guide basically to the path of the railroad. So if you have a day pack and a bottle of water and a sandwich, you can take this book with you and use it to see where the route was, to see photos of what what the world used to be like when steam trains were there. There's all kinds of stuff about how the taverns evolved, a little bit of information about John Muir himself visiting Muir Woods, some information on the gravity cars, and a few maps just so it all makes some sense.
Tune in to part 2 of our conversation with Fred, his philosophy about sound, and his extensive experience in the movies. This conversation is a feature of WildSoundStories.com.